Welcome, everybody. It's a real pleasure to welcome you all to this webinar. I'm Trenton Vance, CEO and founder of Coaching Focus, a coaching consultancy with global reach, working with many well-known organizations. I'm joined today by one of my colleagues, George Lumley. George is a Gen Z, and I have asked him to talk about bridging the gap between the many generations that we now have across the workforce. George will provide a Gen Z perspective, and I, as a Gen X, will, where relevant, ask George to expand on his points so we get a holistic perspective of the situation that we're currently facing within the work environment. So, without further ado, George, welcome.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for the introduction, Trace. And first and foremost, thank you very much to the audience for attending. I know it's difficult to find time out of your busy schedule, and hopefully we can bring in some light to the webinar today on Gen Z special Bridging the Gap. So just to give you a little bit of a flavour and a bit of an insight as to me as an individual and my employment history and my background. I was a former educational teacher, started my way from an agency worker all the way up to qualified teacher status. And then once I hit that point, I decided to transition into a new role, supporting long-term unemployed people move closer to the job market and back into employment. And this was a very rewarding and fulfilling role. My current role at Coaching Focus is creating coaching and mentoring capabilities and to work closely with our clients to deliver impactful and sustainable coaching solutions within organizations and the workplace. A little bit of background about me as an individual outside of work. I'm a very keen and enthusiastic sports player, so my main passion in life is football. That whole team environment ethos is something that I truly thrive within. And something that I uphold most valuable to me is progression and development. I view that very much important in all aspects of life, not only within the workplace, but outside of work. How can you move from point B to point A is something that really, truly ignites me. So looking at the agenda for today, I think it's important to highlight as well, this is what we will be covering, the topics of conversation. But why are we talking about this? And I think truly to understand why we're talking about this is you can dive down many different rabbit holes with this. All of these topics shine a light on retaining top talent within organizations, employer and employee engagement, and how we can leverage that to utilize performance, organizational culture, and how we can drive that forward in the new world of work, and the future of work. How does that look like for a young Gen Z transitioning into that leader position, and the employee experience as well? How does the experience from an employee position look and feel within today's world? So 5 generations, all situated, all coexisting within the workplace, within the organization. Now, as you can see, each individual generation will bring different experiences, different values, different characteristics, different perspectives, different mindsets to that organization. How do they all coexist into one? I think it's a really important topic and point to discuss in a lot of detail. How do leaders set that tone, that expectation, that vision? How do you get 5 different generations singing off the same sheet? And I believe that's through employer and employee buy-in. How does that leader set the tone for those employees? That comes with company values, expectation, standards, and ways of working. And how can you play their best game in the workplace and within the organization? How do you enable that individual to come to work with a purpose, with a mindset that aspires to the organization?
And I think, George, the other interesting point here is the next generation that's coming. So as we start to literally, sadly, lose traditionalists from the workplace, then my understanding is the new generation emerging, those post-2012, is Generation Alpha, which in its way sounds a little bit paradoxical when we talk about the alpha male, and how the power and the ego and the authority may start to come through those new employees that will soon be within the workplace. I don't know if you've got a view of what you've experienced with that sort of younger generation from a Gen Z perspective.
Absolutely. I think it's really important to highlight that the Gen Z and future generations are experiencing and witnessing so much change and transition right in front of their very eyes. The Gen Z have moved into the workplace within organizations, some of which have gone straight into furlough as a result of the pandemic, working from home for long amounts of time and durations of time as well. So those all factors will start to shape the dynamic of the workplace, of the organization, of that employee experience through the Gen Z eyes. And how you can kind of bridge that gap is by setting very, very flexible working options, giving people supported choices in terms of how they play their best game as well, but also taking the learning from the Gen Z and applying that to future generations as well within the workplace and organization setting.
So you talked a lot about the workplace, and I guess what Gen Z are looking for, wanting, demanding to some degree from the workplace. Give us a flavour of, from your perspective as Gen Z, about what you want and how the workplace needs to feel and look and view like for someone like yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. If I move on to the next slide here, for instance, we look at what motivates that Gen Z, what are they motivated by, what makes them tick within the workplace. And it's very interesting to see, and this is some consolidated research that's been put together. And the Gen Zs are looking for individuality, creativity, and choice. And I think one of the key parts here is the choice aspect, giving people supported choices over their own learning, their own CPD, their own ways of working within organizations and settings is truly important to that Gen Z community.
And you talked about individuality. Help me understand what you mean by that, George.
Absolutely. So many organizations now are starting to introduce ways of understanding their employees a lot more efficiently. So this can be achieved through insights profiles, MBTI, communication styles reports, 16 personalities. And this predominantly produces a portfolio, a profile of some description that truly understands the whole. And what I mean by that is that it understands kind of a SWOT analysis, strengths and weaknesses, how best to communicate with me, how best not to communicate with me. There's different aspects that the leaders and employers need to be aware of who's this actual individual that I'm hiring here? What are their strengths? How am I going to make this person become their better selves whilst on that journey with me throughout that employment as well? So that individuality, you can tailor personalized CPD plans to that individual, but also understanding them outside of work. Some individuals like to wake up early and start work at 5 and finish early in the afternoon. How can you almost have that flexible approach as a leader in order for someone to play their best game within the organization?
So what I'm hearing about here is not only individuality, but also flexibility in options and your word choice, that to organizations, leaders are giving individuals in that Gen Z space to be able to create something that works best for them to be able to play their best game.
Absolutely, yeah. No, I couldn't have summed it up perfectly. So yeah, thank you for that. And I think as well that it's very important to highlight here as well is that if Gen Zs aren't receiving this flexibility, those supported choices, they will simply leave and find it elsewhere. The Gen Z are very kind of outgoing and won't stand for much kind of tolerance or anything like that. They know what they want and they will seek it. So having that environment, that organizational culture, where they feel supported, where they feel like they have that flexibility in terms of their work, that work-life balance, supporting individuality, them as a person is truly important within the workplace.
And the final point that you put on your slide here is about valuing independence. So I'm interested from a Gen Z perspective in how does that integrate with interdependency and working with others, collaborating with others, being collegiate, and adjusting to other people's choices or flexibility that Gen Z seem to desire so much?
Absolutely. I think we've highlighted a few points here, especially around that individuality, independency as well. But you're absolutely right. In terms of having that ethos of understanding, how do you empower your team to work collaboratively, is yet again going back to understanding the individuals. Some people would like to sit back and do take in the room, the environment. Some people like to go away, reflect. Some people are quite extroverted, but you can assign different responsibilities, different tasks to those individuals within the team, that they can play their best game, can utilize their strengths, but ultimately you're working as a collective. You're using that team empowerment to find that ultimate goal or objective or new strategy or implement a plan. So you can leverage that interdependency skills towards and direct that towards the rest of the team as well.
Great. So you talk to us about how you feel about the workplace, and I guess what Gen Z want. How does a leader or an organization provide that within the workplace?
Absolutely. So after speaking to some former colleagues, some friends that I met at university, doing some further research into the Gen Z and what they're truly seeking from employers and the organization. Here are just a few kind of summarized points here, some of which we've spoken about already during this webinar. But as you can see here, there's some really quite big standalone things that are really used in the Gen Z generation as anchor points. If a lot of these don't fit the bill, then they'll simply look elsewhere to find an organization that can provide a lot of these topics and benefits as well. So if we look at, for instance, a work-life balance, the Gen Z are looking for that perfect balance between their professional responsibilities and duties, giving the employer, the organization, their time and their efforts, but they also want that time elsewhere to socialize, to be with friends, to be with family, to focus on, say, sports or the gym, for instance, or socialize. Those aspects are equally as valuable to the Gen Z. And if we look at salary as well, for instance, we're going through a time of change and transition, the cost of living, change of governments. Salary is quite important to the Gen Z. They want to feel like they're valued, and that ties into employee benefits and also understanding their needs and different support packages such as mental health support and wellbeing support within organizations as well.
And just help our listeners sort of understand, I guess, from your personal perspective, but talking from your colleagues and other Gen Z individuals, what's the priority? Is it salary? Is it purpose? Is it work-life balance? Is it other benefits that really are at the sort of top of the list, the priority list? Give me an understanding of that, George.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think any one outweighs the other in some regard, and yet again, this may be different to the individual. But speaking as a whole and as a collective, the Gen Z appreciate that the employees have a mixture of all, and some will be at 50%, some will be at 10%, for instance. Some will be more prominent than others within the workplace and the organization. But some of the main ones here, is about how you can not only enable someone to play their best game, and I keep reiterating that point, but it's so important within the workplace and the organization, but also those additional benefits to the employee as well, that Gen Z, about creating that supportive environment, that culture, meaningful work, that CPD, that vision that they're going to be with this company for the duration and not the short duration.
And, excuse me. And you mentioned meaningful work. And one of the things I'm noticing when speaking to other Gen Zs in many other organizations is they're talking about this, putting people before profit, or putting the planet before profit, and being more purposeful and values driven as organizations rather than just focusing on the commercial elements. So give me an understanding of what's been known as the sort of the 3 Ps of performance: people, planet, and profit. Give me an understanding of Gen Z perspective on that, George.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the Gen Z is taken into consideration more and more so, and I think this is going to become more and more prominent within future generations as well, is the impact that they're making, not only within the organization, not only with the working relationships that they may have with clients and employees and employers, but also the wider context here, the planet as well. And one of the things that we do so well is that we're going to be thriving for B Corp as well, which is making our sustainable future brighter for the future generations to move into as well. And that becomes more apparent as well. These are some things that haven't been considered before in past generations, but now these are all very much relevant day-to-day conversations that we're experiencing, and the Gen Z are fully involved within those conversations within the workplace and the wider context as well. So those are very important values to the Gen Z community as well.
Right, that's really useful to hear. So tell me about the things that, excuse me, would stop you from joining an organization, or the things that an organization might do that would facilitate you leaving. So we talked about the things that you need. What are the things that would be a negative from a Gen Z perspective?
I think from my perspective and some of the perspectives that I've spoken to and with some of my friends in other organizations that have simply haven't been sustainable for them to enjoy not only their employment at that company, but also to then move and to venture into other areas of work, is that supportive environment, that culture. If one of the Lego bricks within the Lego structure is not quite right, or it starts to wobble, it starts to make people feel uneasy, uncertain. And if we look at the wider context outside of work, external factors, we're living in very uncertain times at the moment. You know, we're just coming out the end of the pandemic. We have a war in Europe, cost of living crisis through the roof. These are very uncertain times. So when people and the Gen Z community want to come to work, they want to feel like they're supported. They have ownership. They have choice over their meaningful work, their CPD. So creating that as a leader is hugely important in terms of retaining and developing that talent.
And you talk about feel supported. I guess coming from a Gen X perspective and obviously running my own business, I feel that I support or put the support in place. But what does feel the support? What does that look like from a leadership perspective, rather than a sort of a benefits or salary? What's that feeling? What's that sort of behavior, that culture of feeling supported, George?
Absolutely. Well, I think if you take the office environment, I feel as if there's areas where you can go and play your best game by taking your way to quiet areas, working from home, that open door policy that many leaders have, that if you have an issue, if you have a problem, if something's not quite right, then you can use that space, that environment to not only come in and to talk about those issues or problems that may be facing you face first, but also supported by the rest of the team. And that starts with one individual, and that's the leader. And then that filters down within the team and then to the individuals as well. And that also ties in with the values as well. So something that resonates quite strongly with Gen Z is the values. And that's the initial buy-in. You know, most job adverts you may see on Indeed or the organizational website that you see, straight at the very top is the values. Oh, okay, yeah, that resonates with me. I feel at ease. I feel supported because we're singing off the same sheet here. Even though there is a hierarchical difference in some sense, we're still at the same mindset. We've still got that interlinking mindset that, yeah, that value resonates with me as much as it does with the leader as well. So that all kind of coexists into one.
And George, one of the things that I'm curious about is to get an understanding from you about where you feel and where your other Gen Z colleagues feel is that balance of power is at the moment. Because, during the pandemic, we heard about the Great Resignation. I call it the Great Rebalance. A good colleague of mine calls it the Great Reawakening. And I think there has been a reawakening. Now it feels to me as if it's either equal or start to shift to the employee rather than the employer. I'm curious to understand what you're noticing and how you feel that balance is with power within not only our organization, but also what your colleagues are saying with organizations they work within.
Absolutely. It's a very interesting topic, and I've had varied responses from this. Some people have said, God, I've got so much ownership, so much independency. It feels a little bit strange, uncomfortable at times, because the emphasis on you as an individual. Some other people thrive in that environment. the task. I know my professional duties, my responsibilities. I now know what I need to do. If I'm struggling, I have that support network around me to leverage that performance or that task or that topic that you're trying to implement within the organization. So it's a very interesting and very varied topic there, for sure.
Right. And I find it curious that the balance is the reawakening, rebalance, whatever we want to call it. But it feels like it's coming more equal. And it's strange because I don't think both employers or employees quite work out how to manage or to implement that type of ways of working. And there's a great question that's come in, so please put those questions up. We'll have time at the end, but I think it leads nicely into the other point that I know you want to make, which is around the style of leadership that's required in this new world with all these different generations. And what I've heard from you, and it seems like our listeners have also heard, is that more of an autonomous way of working, feeling empowered to have choice and managing yourself rather than being managed. So what's that new style of leadership that all generations will need to adopt and to, I guess, be skilled in?
Absolutely. And I think the first kind of word here that springs to mind is coaching. Is in this ever-changing world where the power has shifted from the employer to employee, or they're trying to rejiggle that kind of balance between the two. They're moving away from the traditional kind of command and control approach within organizations. And leaders are now adopting this new style of coaching to ask more questions, to put the emphasis back onto the employee or the Gen Z. For instance, that which ignites thinking, self-analysis, reflection to find their own kind of answers. And that can be individualized or it can be the teams as well. And I truly do believe that you take the traditional format of coaching, which has the coach, the coachee, but you can really leverage coachable moments within the workplace and the organization. I believe there is a third kind of pillar to this as well, that you can coach yourself. You can use some of the models on yourself. You're stuck with a certain topic, a certain area that's causing you a bit of a headache. You're not quite understanding it. What's the real goal here that you're kind of that you're trying to achieve? The reality of that situation, the options, and the way forward. You can use some of these models on yourself. So setting that coaching culture within the organization is igniting that thinking as well, and that self-reflection, which is in turn going to produce optimum workplace performance.
So what you're saying is that not only developing that leadership coaching rather than leadership management approach, but creating within an organization where you are supporting individuals to be able to self-coach, self-develop in their own way, in their own time, with the choice and flexibility that they require.
Yes, absolutely. No, I couldn't agree more. And I truly do believe we're seeing this more prominent within leaders. Some of the clients that we're speaking to and dealing with on a regular basis is that they're trying to ignite their own thinking and part of their employees as well. How do I support that individual? It's all through a coaching kind of philosophy, a coaching culture as well. And we're seeing that within the results and some of the feedback that we're getting as well upon learning and behavioral styles as well. And also in the research as well, within the wider community of the world of coaching as well. The research is out there to suggest that leaders cannot stay in this stagnated place at the moment. They need to adopt and evolve new styles, i.e. coaching as their new leadership style within organizations to leverage that performance further.
Great. And I guess when we started putting this webinar together, George, and we started to sort of think about what our listeners would start to think about, I fell in, probably as a Gen X perspective, that Gen Zs were either the coachee or the followers, but it's going to be very soon, if not already for yourself, where Gen Zs are the leaders and are the coaches, and the coachee and the follower may well be one of the other generations, a Gen X, a millennial, whatever. So I'm curious to understand from you about your experience of coaching, leading other generations, and your perspective on the impact or the reaction that you might get from, I guess, a hierarchical view of generations.
Absolutely. I mean, within the workplace and organizations now, it's not uncommon to see the 27-year-old leader coaching to the 55-year-old intern, for instance. These are things that we're currently seeing, and it will continue. The Gen Z, they're hungry for development, they're hungry for value, they're hungry for purpose, and that will spark in leaders' minds. They'll be able to see it within the workplace, how they interact with their teams, their clients, etc. And they'll be in those leadership positions, if not now or in the near future, for sure. And that might feel a little bit uncomfortable for some people, having a really young, inspiring leader there, but also might work in the other way as well. That actually this person, yeah, they're Gen Z, they care about the planet, they care about the impact they're making, they care about the organizational growth, they're supporting me through my change and transition in uncertain times. So I think if you kind of flip it on its head, this can be quite an empowering, exciting stage for workplaces and organizations and the future of work as well.
And I think the other thing, just sat here as a Gen X, 55-year-old male, thinking, these things are becoming more balanced and the power is sort of balancing, which is a great thing. But others may feel uncomfortable with that. They're a little bit scared, frightened of what that means for them. Am I, how do I stay fit for purpose in all these changes, not just within the generations, but the other changes that are going on in the workplace? So I think it's something that organizations need to consider as all generations, not just focus on the Gen Z. Yeah,
absolutely.
So, George, we're getting some great questions in. So if I may dig into those, the first one comes from Valerie. And what she's asking is, you talked that values are important to the Z, Generation Z, but where did that perspective of values, or where's that driven from? I know obviously you have personal values, but are there things in your generation that have changed or have influenced the values that you now hold as priority and important for joining an organization?
Absolutely. So after speaking to a few friends and colleagues in different organizations, etc., a lot of their kind of current work is actually assessing and analyzing their values. So you might have 50 values out spread across the table, and they pick out the top 10, and then they finalize it down to the 5, and then seeing how that resonates, how that comes up with people. But also, if you're doing that as a team exercise, you're then understanding the different perspectives of values from other individuals as well. What's driven that value? Why is that value important to you? Why do you uphold that on a day-to-day basis? But also, I truly believe values change as with time as well. So some values will come more into the forefront. And I think especially when we're referring back to the impact, especially on the planet as well, those values need to resonate from organization to employee as well. So all the values across all kind of areas, employee, employer, leader, organization as a whole, as a collective, all need to be aligned together.
And I guess the point that Valerie's trying to make here also, and you talked into it a little bit, and I know it's a question you may not give us some thought, but things like global warming, things like the COVID, the lockdown, things like, sadly, war in Europe, are those things that have made you reflect from your generation to say, life's not about that, it's about these things, and these things are important to me and as a Gen Z individual?
Absolutely, especially during the various lockdowns that we've had in the pandemic. Life just stopped. It almost just, the world stopped spinning in some sense. And you kind of find yourself having to reflect that time, that thought that you can really dig in and really kind of focus your point inwards to yourself. What are my values? What are my anchor points? Where do I want to go when the lockdown's over? And those are truly kind of beautiful moments when you look in and you truly have those anchoring points there and say, what do I want to, where am I now? And where do I want to be in 5-10 years time, for instance? So yeah, absolutely. It does really refine the thought, these external factors such as COVID, war in Europe, sadly, as well, and various other external factors as well.
Great, George, thank you. Here's another great question. Thank you, Jack, for asking this. He's asking, what's Gen Z's outlook on the 4-day week, which we're hearing a lot of organizations are thinking about? Obviously, some have moved towards. So your perspective on the 4-day week.
Absolutely. I think this ties into the work-life balance. So I know that they've done various studies and trials within big organizations to actually bring it down to a 4-day week. I think yet again, this supports the individual and giving people choice as well. Many organizations are doing well-being days. So once a quarter, they may have an afternoon where they can focus on their well-being, put the laptop aside, focus on what you want to do during that time. And all of them all interlink and help one another and help employees play their best game. And yeah, absolutely. I think the 4-day working week is something that is going to be more in the conversation in many years to come. And I wouldn't be surprised if it's not already implemented in some companies, but will be very soon as well.
Yeah. And another great question. Thank you, Peter. And I was thinking this as George was talking through, both of us are Gen X's. And I think what you're talking about what you want is what I want as well. And we shouldn't sort of put people into boxes, generations, they're human beings. So I'm curious from your perspective, George, is that because you're a Gen Z and that's what you've been told you should expect? Or is that because you're a human being and that's what we should all expect?
It's a great question. I mean, even just seeing those kind of what employers should consider slide a couple of slides ago, I think most people would be able to say, yeah, I would actually love a work-life balance. Yeah, I would love to have this. What's the impact I'm making? I would love to be in this supported environment, this coaching culture within the organization. I think most people would naturally gravitate towards those benefits as well. So yeah, no, it's an absolutely very great question for sure. And I think as well that the Gen Z are driving this forward. But I also think that this is across the board as well. So this is something that employers, leaders really need to be considering as well when employing someone, but also evaluating what they're doing at the moment within organizations and the workplace.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And whether you call it evolution or revolution, there's definitely, I go back to the steam engine, the industrial revolution of changes. The workplace is changing. And it's interesting you say that Gen Z have sort of led that. I think that's been facilitated, sadly, by COVID, but it's accelerated just to a more sustainable balance of life and work and expectations that we have of work rather than becoming a drudgery of going to work 9 to 5 from the office and all that stuff. So I think that's, for all generations. And I'm sure our listeners would agree with that. So I have another question from Lisa. Thank you, Lisa. It talks about, workplace are definitely things that will benefit all of us. Would you say, though, George, that Gen Z's view on their response in the workplace is different? And, it's sort of taking away this general responsibility, but you've got this independence and therefore it becomes an expectation rather than feeling like you need to give back. It's about take rather than give as well. What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it comes down to, yet again, the individual as well. But if I'm speaking as a collective, as a whole, the Gen Z are very comfortable, not only with that independency, but they look to seek these things. And like I kind of briefly touched upon earlier, if they're not seeking these benefits, this independency, ownership, this environment, they feel like they can come into work and play their best game, that they're supported, then they'll simply look elsewhere. They're very outspoken. They know what they want. They know what they desire. They know their own self-worth and their own values. And if that's not being considered across all boards or of the company and the organization, then yeah, they're not frightened to speak up about that.
And if we were to say it was a revolution, George, that the workplace is changing, and you were the leader of that revolution of this Gen Z community that's changing the workplace, what would be some of those things that you'd want to see evolve as the revolution unfolds and new ways of working are embraced and adopted?
I think ultimately it's how you support the individual play their best game. And I know I've made this point a couple of times before, but it's understanding the individual first and foremost. What makes them tick? What motivates that individual? What is the impact that they're hoping or trying to or implementing to achieve here? What's that end goal here? And how can you support that individual? So I'd strip it right back, focus on the individual to start off with, and give that person, that individual, that supported choice. If it is working from home 3 days a week, is it if it's having a 4-day working week, or if this person likes to work on Sundays, then absolutely, it's how you enable someone to play their best game, and that is by understanding the individual first and foremost.
So you know me, George, and our listeners are probably similar to my perspective of the world. So there's a slightly challenging question here, which I think is a great one. So Emma says it feels, or sounds like, sorry, that Gen Z are very self-centered. Take of that what you will. So that can have an impact on a collective team or business responsibility. So let me put it in my words. What she's saying is it's all about you. What about the business? We've got to still make money. We've still got to be sustainable from a commercial perspective. Yes, we can have individuality. Yes, we can give flexibility in choice, but we're a business. What's your view to that, George?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I couldn't agree more. Fundamentally, businesses need money to survive. And here I would yet again go back to this whole leadership style of coaching. So for instance, if I had a deadline to meet and I said, when would you like this by? You'd say, for instance, George, when do you think you can get this to me by? So then you're putting the emphasis back onto the Gen Z, the employee, to say, okay, based upon all my other workload, this is when I can get it to you by. And you hold that individual accountable. So yet again, you're giving the ownership back to the employee to ignite that thinking of when realistic times of deadlines, projects, plans, etc., can be implemented effectively within the organization, and then to hold those individuals accountable for that as well. And I think that comes with that whole coaching mindset, culture, which in turn ignites that thinking back onto the employee. But as a business owner, as a leader, you're still getting the output that you desire and what the organization needs to drive that organization forwards.
So what I'm hearing you saying is you need that coaching approach, but you still need that management perspective of keeping you to account. And if those outputs and performance aren't delivered, then there's a consequence of a difficult conversation, whatever, because you need to be held accountable to those outputs. But trying to find that balance, I guess, is the tricky point for both Gen Z, Gen X, and organizations.
Absolutely. And I think that comes in the leadership style and flexing between your leadership style. Some days you might have to have your coaching hat on. Some days you might have to have your leadership hat on. Other days you might have to have your manage hat on with your employee and your team and individuals that you're communicating with on a daily basis. And I think it's, as a leader as well, there's no harm in saying, right, I'm putting my manager's hat on. This is a different conversation we're going to have on because I'm wearing a different hat. This is a different approach to this conversation, and that comes with flexing between that leadership style and those kind of three pillars: coach, manage, and lead.
Yeah, and what I'm certainly noticing of what's happening is very much that there is this balance of trying to find how, as a leadership manager, Gen X type approach, balancing that with the sort of Gen Z who wants to that flexibility, and it's just trying to find it not just for the line manager but for the employee as well, and both are learning. And I think we're in a transition of that move to a new way of operating.
Yeah.
So George, time's got the best of us. I hope we've covered all the points that our listeners wanted to hear. I know that they can connect with you afterwards if they want, and I'll just leave you the final words as a summary and a thank you.
Absolutely, thank you, Trayson. And yeah, I just want to say thank you very much to all the audience and attendees today. Hopefully this has kind of ignited a little bit of food for thought, a little bit of reflection upon the Gen Z bridging the gap. And likewise, if you have any other questions at all post this, then please feel free to either call or to send me an email. More than happy to take some time out to answer any further questions. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, George. And we'll be putting this on our website and through the normal social channels. So look out for that, share with your colleagues. And as George said, we're all up for ideas and thoughts about coaching for a better tomorrow. Thank you all.